Tématem této videolekce je
Today's topic is Central Europe as a place of cultural exchange and exchange of knowledge. It is a topic that covers many different aspects, so we have divided it into three parts. In the first part, we will look at the general geographical and historical context that is important for understanding Central Europe as a whole. They show Central Europe as a specific geographic and historical space, whose essence is its diversity. In the second part, we will see how the answer to the question of what Central Europe actually is has changed. In the third part, we will use concrete examples from the history of education, science and culture to show how the Central European space was, on the one hand, influenced creatively by cultural impulses from all over Europe, and how, on the other hand, it gave birth to ideas and cultural values which addressed and still address people all over the world.
oslovují lidi na celém světě.
Europe, a continent that covers the western part of Eurasia. It has its north, south, west and east. But does it also have a centre? If we were to look at Europe from space, we would note that many great rivers flow through the continent. Let's recall the most famous of these: the Thames, Loire, Seine, Rhine, Danube, Vistula, Dnieper, Volga, Don. So let us be carried down by the flow of rivers. The majestic Vistula and the slightly smaller Oder flow into the Baltic Sea. The Oder is the second most important Polish river within its catchment area in the western regions of Poland. It rises in Moravia in the Oder Hills, and from its source in the interior of the continent, its waters travel nearly 900 kilometers to the sea. West of the Oder, another of Europe's great rivers flows into the North Sea. Since ancient times it has borne the name Elbe, which originally probably meant simply river. From the sea upstream, its course leads to the source, which is located in the Krkonoše Mountains. At nearly 1,100 kilometers long, the Elbe is the 12th longest river in Europe and drains the eastern regions of Germany and Bohemia. On the other hand, the centre and southeast of the continent is dominated by the Danube. From its source in the German Black Forest to its mighty delta flowing into the Black Sea, this great river reaches a length of 2,857 kilometers. The Danube is Europe's second longest and its largest river. The Danube drains much of the central and southeastern parts of the European continent and has many major tributaries. One of them, the Morava, rises beneath the summit of the Kralitsky Sněžník mountain range. From a pan-European perspective, the source of the Morava River lies near the source of the Oder and the Elbe, somewhat as if it were located in between them. And just hundreds of meters from the source of the Morava River is a remarkable place in Europe, a place where the borders of three European watersheds join. From here, the waters diverge, with the Oder and its tributaries into the Baltic Sea, with the Elbe and its tributaries into the North Sea, and with the mighty Danube and its tributaries into the Black Sea. This is also the location of our three Central European countries: Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic. We will be concentrating on these, although the Central European framework also includes Slovakia, Austria, and in some concepts other countries as well.
Znamená to, že jsme našli střed Evropy?
Does this mean that we have found the center of Europe? It's hard to say. Rivers are undoubtedly very important in the life of human cultures, but there are many ways to look for the European center, or the area we might call Central Europe. However, the rivers and watersheds suggest that the area where our countries are located is geographically diverse, and can perhaps also be characterized by the word crossroads, a geographical crossroads, and also an historical crossroads. The Danube, Elbe, Oder and Vistula are more than just natural arteries. They have also shaped people's lives for thousands of years. Human populations migrated along them into the interior of the continent. Archaeologists have recorded traces of the presence of diverse human cultures since the Upper Paleolithic. Who doesn't know the beautiful Paleolithic statuettes of women, which we called somewhat inaccurately Venuses?
Řeky umožňovaly také obchod.
Rivers also enabled trade and secured contact between distant areas. They helped connect north with south, east with west. Thanks to them, this region also became an important communication corridor throughout history, enabling the exchange of raw materials, goods and knowledge. Since ancient times, it was crossed by the main trade route connecting the Baltic Sea with the Mediterranean. It was called the Amber Route, after the amber which was a significant part of this trade. But it wasn't just about trade. The Amber Route was also an important cultural artery, connecting the communities of Central and Northern Europe with the advanced civilizations of the Mediterranean. The ancient Roman Empire even extended to the Danube and built its northern fortified border, the Limes Romanos, on the river to defend its territory.
V tisíciletích pravěkých dob se v regionu vystřídalo mnoho etnik.
In the millennia of prehistoric times, many ethnic groups and cultures flourished in the region. Numerous archaeological finds testify to their lives, but we do not know their names. It was only with the discovery of writing that the names of some Central European peoples emerged from the darkness of the ages. We know from the works of Greek and Roman scholars that the region was inhabited by the Celts for several centuries. Then the area was settled by Germanic tribes who fought against those Roman legions seeking to expand the Roman world into the regions beyond the Danube. When the Western Roman Empire was falling apart, these Germanic peoples migrated to the regions of southern and western Europe. The region along the Danube was controlled for a time by Avar invaders and then permanently settled by Western Slavs. It is in them that today's Poles, Czechs and Slovaks see their ancient ancestors. And in the 9th and 10th centuries, the nomadic Hungarians also adopted the eastern part of the region as their permanent homeland.
Charakteristickým rysem této části Evropy tak byla
Thus, a characteristic feature of this part of Europe was ethnic, linguistic and cultural diversity. This remained the case even after the peoples of Central Europe adopted Christianity at the end of the first millennium Common Era, and became an integral part of the medieval world. The Holy Roman Empire radiated its Christian universalist concept throughout the Central European region, and even the lands of the Czech Slavs were part of its territory. Nevertheless, the ethnic, linguistic and cultural diversity of Central Europe did not disappear. On the contrary, as a result of medieval migration from west to east, German settlements spread throughout the region, and with it, towns began their dynamic development.
Není tedy divu, že etnická a kulturní
It is therefore not surprising that ethnic and cultural diversity was a significant organizing force in the political order of this space. Three kingdoms, Hungarian, Polish and Bohemian, formed in the Middle Ages. At some times they lived together in peace and cooperation. At others they fought against each other. Although for a time 2 or 3 kingdoms found themselves under the rule of one ruling dynasty, the Luxemburgs, the Jagiellonians, and for many centuries the Habsburgs, they all carefully guarded their own distinct political identities.
svou zvláštní politickou identitu. Když však v moderní době habsburský panoval,
However, in modern times, when the Habsburg ruler began to increasingly strive for the centralization and unification of his hereditary Austrian duchy with the Hungarian and Bohemian kingdoms into a single Austrian state, and when even the Poles, under pressure from more powerful neighbors, could not avoid the demise of their state, forces of resistance awoke in the cultural and political elites of the resurgent Central European nations and sought national recognition and autonomy. The Habsburgs repeatedly tried to find a viable solution for this part of Europe under their rule. However, they encountered differing ideas and interests. The solution found in the 1860s, the so-called Austro-Hungarian dualism, was able to satisfy only some of these nations. As soon as the First World War broke out, the Habsburgs lost the last remnants of confidence that they could organize the ethnic, linguistic and cultural diversity of Central Europe within their empire. New states were established in 1918 and 1919 on the ruins of defeated Austria-Hungary. These included the direct predecessors of modern-day Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic.
bylo by možné
It would be possible to delve into and further develop each of these, and in fact we do this in other parts of the course. For now, we can manage with just these most basic facts, since they point to the special character of the European region that we here called Central Europe.
říkáme střední Evropa. Pojem střední Evropa jsme samozřejmě
Of course, we are not the ones who invented the term Central Europe. It spread in the 19th and 20th centuries and is itself the result of the process of modern collective identities forming among the people living in the Elbe, Oder and Danube basins. The concept of Central Europe first appeared in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna, which ended the Napoleonic Wars. Back then, however, it meant a completely different area of Europe than it does today, Germany and the Benelux countries. However, it did not catch on and disappeared from political discourse again for many decades.
Teprve na přelomu 19. a 20.
It was only at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries that the term was rediscovered by German geographers. In their vision, Central Europe, Mitteleuropa, meant the area of German political, economic and cultural influence east of the borders of the German Empire. During the First World War, the concept of Mitteleuropa served to express Germany's war ambitions regarding the future organization of the territory beyond its eastern borders. Germany and Austria-Hungary were to be unified economically and to a large extent politically. The most famous spokesman for this idea was the evangelical theologian and liberal politician Friedrich Naumann, who primarily had in mind economic unity and proposed organizing the region's great ethnic diversity through national self-governments. However, the intellectual and political representation of the non-German peoples of Central Europe could hardly agree with Naumann's concept of Mitteleuropa.
S Naumannovou ideou Mitteleuropy těžko mohla souhlasit. Na zásadní nesouhlas však jeho myšlenky narazily také.
However, his ideas also encountered deep-rooted opposition within the ultranationalist camp in Germany. In Hitler's vision for Central Europe, there was no place for small nations. In World War II, Hitler's dictatorship began to implement its racist utopia, spreading ethnic hatred and applying racist and genocidal policies against Jews, Roma and Slavic peoples in the occupied and annexed territories of Central and Eastern Europe.
Židům, Romům a slovanským národům. Nacismus naštěstí ztroskotal.
Fortunately, Nazism failed, and thus the German concept of Mitteleuropa was utterly discredited. Central Europe seemed to have disappeared from the mental maps of Europeans. Within a few years of 1945, the area where Central European peoples lived became part of the Soviet Eastern Bloc. From the perspective of the Western world, pluralistic and liberal democratic, it now seemed to be a fact that the destiny of this part of Europe belonged to the European East. It was as if it had always formed a kind of Western outpost of a mystical and autocratic world, embodied in the 20th century in the powerful Soviet Empire, supposedly heading towards a dreamed-of communist tomorrow. However, the idea of including Poland, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the then state of Czechs and Slovaks, among the countries of the East, sparked a protest from isolated Central European intellectuals. Many of them fled communism into exile in the West. How could they agree to such a classification of their homeland as part of the East? Polish conservative historian Oskar Halecki, who went into American exile due to the German invasion of Poland, drew attention to the key position of Central Europe. Central Europe, which Halecki then divided into a central western part and a central eastern part, formed the edge of Western civilization. At the same time, however, Central Europe was a region of transition, as it was there that intensive clashes and encounters with the civilization of Eastern Europe took place. The misfortune for the states of this part of Europe was that the Nazi megalomaniacal attempts at dominance pushed the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, such as Poland, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, towards the east. Hungarian historian Jenő Szűcs thought the same way, but emphasized a certain paradoxical nature of Central Europe's position between East and West. Geographically, this area was on the western edge of Eastern Europe. However, from the perspective of historical development, social structures and legal institutions, Central Europe belonged on the eastern edge of Western Europe. According to Szűcs, this remarkable fact was the reason for the instability characteristic of the history of this European region. A different concept of Central Europe was offered by the Hungarian writer and dissident György Konrád, who drew attention to the common heritage of the long-dead Habsburg monarchy. The inconspicuous cultural relics of its former glory that survive in the local cultural landscapes, such as cafes and railway stations built similarly throughout the monarchy in the 19th century, maintain to this day a vague but vivid sense of a common Central European experience among the inhabitants of the territories of the former monarchy. Brno native Milan Kundera, who lived in exile in France after the occupation of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact troops, entered the debate about Central Europe with his 1983 essay, The Stolen West, or The Tragedy of Central Europe. The essay was not an attempt at a precise definition of Central Europe. It was a critical reflection on the surprising experience of a Central European exile in the second half of the 20th century, that Europeans in the West had forgotten the Western affiliation of this part of Europe and had classified it as part of the East.
Přesto esej Kunderovo pojetí střední Evropy prozrazuje.
Nevertheless, the essay reveals Kundera's concept of Central Europe. The author could not, of course, reflect on the events that followed the fall of the Iron Curtain, because for him they were still in the future. Despite this, Kundera anticipates the post-revolutionary slogans of Central European nations about a return to Europe. This world-renowned writer, who had been a communist in his youth and became famous primarily for his philosophical existential novels The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, 1978, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, 1984, and Immortality, 1990, had no doubt that the nations of Central Europe longed to be part of the West.
Touží být součástí Západu. Proč nepochyboval?
Why did he have no doubts? Because he knew for sure that Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians and Poles had always belonged to Western civilization. A cursory glance at their history is enough to dispel any doubt. Prior to 1945, none of these nations belonged to Eastern European civilization, including the Austrians, who also shared the fate of Central Europe under Habsburg rule, but were fortunate enough to break free of Soviet influence in the 1950s.
V 50. letech vymanili. Nechme promluvit Kunderu samotného.
Let Kundera speak for himself. That is why the Europe which I call Central experiences the change in its fate after 1945, not only as a political catastrophe, but as a questioning of its civilization. The deep meaning of resistance in these countries is the defense of their identity, or put in other words, it is a defense of their Western character.
Západního charakteru. Ovšem postavení střední Evropy ve vztahu.
However, the position of Central Europe in relation to the West has always been culturally specific. It never became the West completely, but it was certainly not the East. He saw the core of Central Europe in the countries of the former Habsburg Empire. But in reality, according to Kundera, it was futile to wish to define the exact boundaries of this area. Let us quote him briefly once again. Because Central Europe is not a state, but a culture or a destiny, its border is imaginary and must be drawn again and again for each new historical situation.
A znovu vytyčovat. Popravdě řečeno.
Kundera is ultimately able to define Central Europe more precisely in geographical terms. It is the region of Europe inhabited by small nations between Russia and Germany, a region that is repeatedly claimed and rendered insecure by both sides through the threat of military occupation, and often even the threat of national extinction. According to Kundera, being a small nation does not depend on the size of the national community, but on the fact that a nation can be called into question, denied, and can disappear from the map of European nations, swallowed up by a large neighbour. No Frenchman, Englishman, German or Russian has ever known this collective experience. However, through historical experience, the peoples of Central Europe have it engraved very deeply into their collective memory. Kundera noticed that the national anthems of great nations usually speak of greatness and eternity. However, the anthems of Central European nations express existential uncertainty. The first verse of the Polish anthem reads, "Poland has not yet perished." Kundera's essay was written 40 years ago. Even today, its Central European message has not disappeared.
Její středoevropské poselství.
A few years before his death, Kundera donated his extensive library to his hometown. When it was made available to the public, it became a unique institution of memory commemorating the fate of a Central European writer in the second half of the 20th century. But the writer Milan Kundera is not the only prominent figure in the cultural history of Central Europe. The opposite is true. Cultural and ethnic diversity here has given rise to a number of important Central European intellectuals. Let us recall here at random one scholar from each country. In the 17th century, Jan Hevelius, as mathematician and pioneer of the topography of the lunar surface, lived in Gdansk. In the 19th century, Moravian native and founder of genetics Gregor Johann Mendel conducted his research on pea cultivation in Brno. and in the 20th century, Hungarian lawyer, politician and philosopher István Bibó investigated the cause of the instability of the political order of contemporary Europe.
Filozof István Bibó.
Just take a look at the list of Nobel Prize laureates, and you will find that there are 29 scientists, scholars and writers who came from Central Europe. Among them, Hungary is remarkably successful, with 15 award-winning personalities, such as quantum physicist Eugene Paul Wigner, who participated in the secret Manhattan Project in the USA during the Second World War. Poland is particularly interesting in this context because the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize and the first woman to win the prize in 2 different scientific disciplines came from Warsaw. An exceptionally gifted scientist, Marie Sklodowska-Curie, made significant contributions to advances in radioactivity research. In 1903, she won the Nobel Prize in Physics together with her husband Pierre Curie and colleague Henri Becquerel. 8 years later, she also received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the discovery of the elements radium and polonium, and for research related to the isolation of radium. However, scientific achievements cannot be taken for granted. Scientific research draws on a high level of education in society, and Central Europe offers this more than adequately. Here, the tradition of compulsory primary school attendance dates back to the Enlightenment times of Empress Maria Theresa. The tradition of the highest level of education, higher education, began here during the High Middle Ages. The universities of Prague, Kraków and Pécs, founded in the 14th century following Italian and French models, were the first parts of an extensive educational network that today densely covers Central Europe, creating a culture of a symbiosis of education and scientific research. The foundations of this university culture in Central Europe were laid down by Charles University in Prague. It was founded in 1348 by Charles IV, Czech king and Holy Roman Emperor from the House of Luxembourg. It was the first university beyond the Alps and is claimed as the oldest university in the Czech lands and in Germany. The history of Prague University is filled with ups and downs that reflect the turbulent history of the Czech lands. After a magnificent Gothic beginning, its foundation resulting from the Hussite Wars, the university became the intellectual centre of Czech Utricism for 2 centuries. During the 17th century, the Jesuits took over the university. The original college, the Gothic Carolinum, was merged with the Clementinum, the previous Jesuit educational academy, and the university was renamed Charles Ferdinand University by Emperor Ferdinand III. Following the abolition of the Jesuits at the end of the 18th century, the university became a state institution. And in the following century of national movements and nationalism, Prague University became the subject of ethnic clashes between Czechs and Germans in the Czech lands. In 1882, these Czech-German disputes resulted in the division of the university into 2 parts, Czech and German. However, nationalist disputes over the University of Prague continued into the 20th century. Shortly after the creation of Czechoslovakia, the German university was denied the right to use the name of its founder, Charles IV. During the German occupation of the Czech lands 20 years later, the Nazis closed not only the Czech University in Prague, but all other Czech universities in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. After the Second World War, the Czech Charles University was restored, and conversely, the German university was abolished, for good. Despite its turbulent history, Charles University is an unquestionable centre of Central European intellectual ferment and an irreplaceable part of European cultural history. A number of important figures of at least European significance have worked at it. In 1409, the Czech religious reformer Jan Hus became its rector. Active at it in the 19th century was the brilliant mathematician and Catholic theologian Bernard Bolzano. And at the end of the century, the philosopher, sociologist, and later the first president of Czechoslovakia, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. In the 20th century, physicist and author of the theory of relativity Albert Einstein and philosopher Jan Patočka lectured there. The Czech Nobel Prize laureate in chemistry, the discoverer of polarography, Jaroslav Hejrovský, linked his entire scientific career to it.
Jaroslav Hejrovský.
Since the Middle Ages, universities have brought together people from different parts of Europe. and universities became one of the important institutions that facilitated a significant transnational exchange of knowledge and cultural values. The Polish example now takes us to the 16th and 17th centuries. It shows inter alia that not only monarchs, as we have already seen in the case of the University of Prague, but also educated aristocrats who were influenced by their experiences and knowledge from their own university studies and their travels across Western Europe, sought to enrich and develop domestic culture through cultural models from other parts of Europe.
Rola Rzeczypospolitej Obojga Narodów w XVI i XVII wieku jako odbiorcy i przekaźnika kultury może być postrzegana na dwa sposoby. Zarówno w kontekście kultury ogólnoeuropejskiej, jak i lokalnej wymiany kulturowej. Już w XV wieku nowe prądy kulturowe docierały dzięki kontaktom politycznym i kulturalnym z Węgrami, gdzie na dworze Macieja Korwina i Władysława Jagiellończyka zagościła kultura i sztuka renesansu. Głównym propagatorem idei humanizmu był jednak Włoch Filippo Buonaccorsi, zwany Kalimachem, sekretarz królewski i wychowawca synów króla Kazimierza Jagiellończyka. Z kolei rozkwit przeżywała także wówczas Akademia Krakowska, do której na studia przybywało wielu wybitnych uczonych, humanistów i studentów z Europy Środkowej oraz z Włoch i Niemiec. Studenci Akademii, wracając do swoich krajów, szerzyli dalej kulturę, którą chłonęli w Krakowie. Również krakowski dwór Zygmunta Starego i jego syna Zygmunta Augusta stał się ośrodkiem kultury renesansu. W XVI wieku pojawiło się na nim wiele wybitnych postaci. Sam Zygmunt Stary został ukształtowany w kulturze renesansu, przebywając na dworze swojego brata Władysława na Węgrzech. Również królowa Bona wśród swoich dworzan i współpracowników miała wielu humanistów, choć niemal samych Włochów. Wielu z polskich uczonych utrzymywało kontakty ze znakomitymi propagatorami humanizmu na Zachodzie, na przykład z Erasmem z Rotterdamu. Ogromne znaczenie dla polskiej kultury renesansu miały podróże polskich uczonych i szlachty na uniwersytety na Zachodzie i południu Europy. Już pod koniec XV wieku Mikołaj Kopernik swoje studia kontynuował na Uniwersytecie w Bolonii. Z kolei w połowie XVI wieku na Uniwersytecie w Padwie kształcili się m.in. pochodzący z Węgier późniejszy król Polski Stefan Batory, jego późniejszy nadworny kroniczkarz Niemiec Reinhold Heidenstein i polski magnat, wybitny dowódca i polityk Jan Zamojski. Z kolei rozwój sztuki renesansu w Polsce wiąże się z przybyciem do Krakowa Franciszka Florentczyka. Na przełomie XV i XVI wieku wykonał on szereg prac w katedrze wawelskiej w stylu renesansowym, a później król Zygmunt I Stary powierzył mu przebudowę zamku na Wawelu. Jego pracę kontynuował jeszcze bardziej rozsławiony Bartolomeo Berrecci. Obaj Włosi stworzyli zamek, który stał się wzorem dla innych tego typu budowli w Polsce. Zwłaszcza godne naśladowania był czworoboczny, zamknięty dziedziniec z galerią arkadową. Zygmunt Stary zlecił także Berecciemu wybudowanie kaplicy na Wawelu, mauzoleum ostatnich Jagiellonów. Kaplica zygmuntowska stała się wzorcem tego typu budowli w kościołach całej Polski. Berecci projektował także na zamówienie magnatów kaplice i nagrobki w całej Polsce, m.in. w katedrze w Poznaniu, Warszawie czy w Tarnowie. Sztuka renesansu rozpropagowana została w ten sposób w całym kraju. Nie tylko mecenasami sztuki byli monarchowie, ale wielu wpływowych, ważnych szlachciców i mieszczan. Do Polski i na Litwę przybywali nowi artyści z Włoch i Niderlandów, którzy uzyskiwali sporo zamówień z zakresu rzeźby i architektury. Zmieniała się architektura miast, w których przebudowywano kamienice w stylu renesansowym. W niektórych miastach przebudowywano lub budowano na wzór renesansowy ratusze miejskie. Najpiękniejsze z nich powstały w Poznaniu, Sandomierzu, Chełmie i Zamościu. Wybitnym włoskim architektem i rzeźbiarzem był także Santi Gucci, nadworny artysta na dworach Zygmunta Augusta i Stefana Batorego. Miał on także sporo zamówień spoza dworu królewskiego. Do jego najwybitniejszych dzieł należą zamek w Baranowie Sandomierskim czy nagrobki Zygmunta Augusta, Stefana Batorego i Anny Jagiellonki z katedry wawelskiej. W drugiej połowie XVI wieku pojawili się również polscy architekci i rzeźbiarze zyskujący sporą renomę, jak na przykład Jan Michałowicz z Urzędowa, autor nagrobków biskupów katedry wawelskiej, poznańskiej czy kolegiaty łowickiej. Nie tylko transfer kulturowy dokonywał się w akademiach, dworach królewskich czy magnackich za sprawą przybywających na nie artystów, architektów i uczonych. Również wymiana kulturowa zachodziła na pograniczu państw. Na zachodzie Polski, na pograniczu Wielkopolski, Śląska, Brandenburgii i Pomorza w XVI i na początku XVII wieku zachodziły procesy migracyjne. Szlachta zamieszkująca po polskiej stronie była niekiedy właścicielami majątków na Śląsku, jak choćby rodziny Kotwiczów czy Zechertosów. Jednocześnie na obszary polskie przybywała szlachta niemieckojęzyczna ze Śląska, Brandenburgii czy Pomorza, kupując majątki, osiedlając się na stałe i przyswajając polską kulturę. Większość z tej szlachty polonizowała się, jak choćby Unrugowie, po niemiecku von Unruch, Schlichtingowie, po niemiecku Schlichting, Wedlowie tuczyński, po niemiecku Wedel, czy Brezowie, po niemiecku von Briesen. Często nawet piastowała ona wysokie urzędy w regionie. Jednak byli tacy, którzy wciąż posługiwali się językiem niemieckim w mowie i w piśmie, o czym świadczą choćby wnoszone przez nich dokumenty do ksiąg sądowych. Jaką rolę odgrywała ta migracja w transferze kulturowym? Z pewnością szlachta z krajów niemieckojęzycznych była dodatkowym nośnikiem prądów religijnych, zwłaszcza szerzenia luteranizmu na terenach zachodniej Polski w XVI wieku. W dodatku związki polskiej i niemieckojęzycznej szlachty ze Śląska, Brandenburgii i Pomorza zacieśniały się dzięki małżeństwom i koligacjom rodzinnym, jakie niejednokrotnie zachodziły między najwyższą warstwą społeczną. To z kolei powodowało, że wzory kulturowe przenoszone były ponad granicami. Szlachta śląska i brandenburska przyjęła polskie obrzędy pogrzebowe. Świadczy o tym choćby w XVII wieku umieszczanie portretów trumiennych z wizerunkami zmarłych w czasie ceremonii pogrzebowej. W ten sposób można stwierdzić, że szlachta pogranicza wytworzyła swój oryginalny wkład w kulturę polską i niemiecką. Innym elementem kultury polskiej przeszczepianym po drugiej stronie granicy, tym razem na Śląsk, była tradycja samorządności szlacheckiej. Szlachta śląska pod koniec XVI wieku wywierała presję na rządzących, aby stworzyć podobną reprezentację polityczną, jaką miała polska szlachta. Wzorem Polski zdecydowano się wprowadzać niektóre elementy polskiej tradycji sejmowej. W księstwie głogowskim wprowadzono choćby głosowanie jednomyślne w Wiriti.
Názorně jsme viděli, že kulturní a vědomostní...
We have clearly seen that cultural and knowledge exchange from other parts of Europe and the world has a significant and beneficial impact on society as a whole, and in addition to thought, indelibly transforms and shapes the cultural landscape of Central Europe. The Polish example also showed that in addition to scholars and scientists, artists, builders, inventors, as well as composers and writers also participate in cross-border and transnational cultural exchange. It is impossible to remember everyone. To create an idea of how the works of Central European authors radiate the experience of the Central European world and contribute to world culture, it is sufficient to name a few selected writers.
Vedle již zmíněného Milana Kundery nelze nezmínit českého...
In addition to the already mentioned Milan Kundera, one cannot fail to mention the Czech satirist Jaroslav Hašek, the Prague German Jewish writer Franz Kafka, the great Polish writer of the 19th century Adam Mickiewicz, the poet and essayist Czesław Miłosz, the 2018 Nobel Prize laureate Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk, the romantic and revolutionary poet of the 19th century Sándor Petőfi, and the Hungarian 20th century writer Sándor Márai, captured the disappearing diversity of Central Europe in his work.
který ve svém díle zachytil zanikající středoevropskou rozmanitost.
And Imre Kertész, who enshrined the terrible time of the Nazi genocide of the Jews in eternal memory.
Nacistické genocidy Židů.
Magyarországon a Közép-Európáról szóló tudásközvetítésnek két kitűnő példája, ezt a szép irodalomban Márai Sándor, másrészt pedig a politikai gondolkozásban Bibó István. Ugye Márai Sándor élete önmagában a 20. századi közép-európai értelmiség életének a lenyomata, aki a Trianon utáni időszakban Csehszlovákiában magyar kisebbségi íróként működött, és így aztán egyszerre volt tagja a magyarországi magyar szépirodalomnak, illetve a csehszlovákiai szépirodalomnak, mint egy kisebbségi szerző, de a német irodalmi közegben is kiválóan mozgott, és aztán emigrációba kényszerült, szembeállt mind a két közép-európai totalitárius rendszerrel, műveinek magyarországi kiadását ahhoz kötötte, hogy Magyarország ismét függetlenné váljon. Magyarországi emlékezete az a totalitárius korszak előtti magyar polgári világ emlékezete volt, és aztán a magyarországi politikai fordulat 1989 után újra megjelentek művei, gyakorlatilag a polgári Magyarország reneszánszát látták Márai műveinek a újabb kiadásaiban, sőt, az 1990-es évek végén, amikor a Gyertyák Csonkigének című művének az angol kiadása megjelent, akkor gyakorlatilag futótűzként indultak meg közép-európai fordításai a műveinek, és az egész közép-európai régióban, Lengyelországban, Csehországban, Szlovákiában közép-európai íróként ünnepelték a közép-európaiság egyik legjobb, legfontosabb szépirodalmi megjelenítőjeként, és számtalan fordítás készült a műveiből. Bibó István pedig a politikatudományban, vagy a politikai közéletben testesítette meg a közép-európaiságot Magyarországon. Egy olyan polgári értelmiségi volt, aki kapcsolódott a két világháború közötti Közép-Európa gondolkozáshoz, közép-európai vitákhoz. Az Oskar Halecki, Jaroszlav Bidló féle Közép-Európa meghatározásokra alapozva, vagy ezekből és merítve írta meg, vagy adta ki 1946-ban a közép-európai kisállamok nyomorúságáról szóló művét, ami a magyarországi Közép-Európa gondolkozás alapműve, rengetegszer idézett munkája, gyakorlatilag a magyarországi regionális identitás egyik alapműve lett, és az 1956-os forradalomban játszott közéleti szerepe pedig végképp egy emblematikus, a független Magyarország egy emblematikus politikai gondolkozója magasságába emelte Bibót. Márai Sándor és Bibó István nem csak életművükkel, hanem egész életükkel fontos személyiségei voltak a Magyarországon, a közép-európai régióról való közös gondolkozásunknak, arról a tudástól, ami a közép-európai régióhoz kapcsolja Magyarországot.
Střední Evropa
Central Europe is much more than one of the possible geographical centres of the continent. It is a remarkable crossroads of cultures, a place where East meets West, not only by its location, but also by its influence. It is an area characterized by the coexistence of smaller European nations, which receive cultural stimuli from other parts of Europe and transform them into their own culture. This allows them to stand up on the European stage among the great nations of the West and the East.
Jedinečnou činí střední Evropu právě její etnická.
What makes Central Europe unique is its ethnic, linguistic and cultural diversity, and the resulting necessity of seeking paths to understanding. The coexistence of Central European nations has not always been without difficulty, but mutual competition combined with the need to cooperate has permitted a special and truly unique region to emerge in this part of the European continent. The course, one of the video lessons of which is now ending, was created thanks to the collaboration of students and academics from Hungary, Poland and the Czech Republic. It is thus living proof that Central Europe remains an area of diversity, but is also a space of shared knowledge, mutual respect and ongoing dialogue.
A pokračujícího dialogu.